is this legal? Can companies really do this? Say nothing of states, counties, that sort of thing. Brian Claypool joins, a civil rights attorney, very smart when it comes to legal matters. I appreciate that. Brian, I'll just add yes outright then. What these companies are trying to enforce, can they?
Yeah, Neil, great to be back with you. The law is not always black and white. People want easy answers, but they're not going to get it here. We don't have any local, state, or federal statutes, Neil, or regulations that speak to this issue. And we have very little what's called case law, courts interpreting decisions that exist on this issue as well. So what do we have to look at then? We have to look at what some states are doing now, or what some courts are doing now, which is, does this vaccine mandate violate employment laws within various states? And the early trending results are that employers can require you to have a COVID vaccine or you lose your job. I mean, you've got two exemptions, but they're hard to qualify for. One is the medical and one is the religious. But Neil, bear in mind, most employees across the country are what are called at-will employees. What does that mean? They don't have a written contract that requires them to be terminated for cause. So employers can arguably fire employees for pretty much any reason, and that includes not getting a COVID-19 vaccine.
But didn't the president bring this up another notch, if you think about it, Brian, by working through OSHA to get companies with more than 100 workers to demand just this?
Yeah, so President Biden has enacted this new rule through OSHA that requires employers with 100 or more employees to require vaccines. I mean, that's a big step. I mean, I think the Department of Justice came out in July of this year, issued what's called a memorandum on the issue, and it was leaning in favor of the vaccine mandate. And you might be surprised to hear this, Neil, but I'll give you three quick examples. There was a case in Texas involving employees at a medical center, didn't want to get the COVID-19 vaccine. They filed a lawsuit that the district court in Texas ruled in favor of the medical center, and the appellate court in Texas, of all places, declined to review that. So that means that that becomes the law temporarily in Texas. You also have a case in Arkansas. You had 45 employees from a medical center in Arkansas saying, hey, you can't fire us. We have a religious exemption. Employer came back, said, you don't have a religious exemption. By the way, a lot of people are using the fetal cell argument as a religious exemption, and that's getting blown out of the water as well, because that's not technically used in the vaccine. And then the big one recently here in California, the NBA, National Basketball Association, just declined a religious exemption for Andrew Wiggins, who's a star player for the Golden State Warriors. I mean, Neil, that is colossal. The NBA now is saying you can't even get a religious exemption for COVID-19 vaccines.
The backdrop for this is if the more spikes in cases we have, it seems like the more protection these companies, teams, to your, counties and all have an edge, because they can say, look, this is what we're dealing with. And if people don't get vaccinated, it's only going to get worse. But if things subside, do they have less of a leg to stand on?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, let's focus on the first part of that question. I mean, employers, think about it, Neil. They have a duty, an incumbent duty to create a safe work environment for their employees. So right now, they're in a catch-22 or a quandary. If we don't require vaccines, then people within our workforce are going to get sick. They might come down with COVID, and then they might be facing a barrage of civil lawsuits because employees got COVID. So they can't really win with that. So they've chosen the other route, which is we're going to have a safe workplace. You need to get a COVID vaccine. But you're right. What happens a couple years from now, 5 years from now, where the COVID numbers go down dramatically, maybe we have herd immunity, then at that point in time, we might be talking about different results within the court systems. And speaking of that, there's no uniformity as well, Neil. That's what people don't understand, too. We could get a different result in California versus Florida from these court systems.
Something tells me eventually this is going to wind up in the Supreme Court. What do you think?
Well, I think it is going to end up in the Supreme Court, and that's going to be an interesting ruling because, I just mentioned a case that was heard in Texas that, that's a conservative state, and the U.S. Court of Appeals there ruled in favor of the employer and the vaccine mandate. So I don't think it's a slam dunk that if this reaches the U.S. Supreme Court, that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to say, hey, you can't have these vaccine mandates for COVID-19. Remember, Neil, there was one case back in the early 1900s that dealt with the chickenpox vaccine, and the U.S. Supreme Court did weigh in on that, and I think it was 1915, and said that the localities, states, and federal governments could implement a chickenpox vaccine mandate. I mean, this could very well just turn into another required vaccine like chickenpox and all the other vaccines that we're required to get. Or it could turn into a new legal battle in a few years when the COVID-19 cases decline.
Brian, you really know your stuff. I mean, you're going back to the early 1900s and chickenpox. I mean, you do your homework, young man. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Right? All right. No, I appreciate that, Brian. You kind of clarified a lot of things. Brian Claypool on all of this and how far companies, even states, cities, even the country can go on this. Speaking of all things vaccine, Pfizer.